This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Rinaldo Walcott, who teaches in the Department of Africana and American Studies at University of Buffalo. In addition to a number of scholarly essays and public media articles, he has written Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora and Black Studies, Black Life, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom, and in 2021 he published both the Long Emancipation, Moving Towards Freedom, and On Property, Policing, Prisons, and the Call for Abolition. In this conversation, we explore the varied political meanings of Black studies as a field of research and modality of struggle, the relation of politics to cultural and national studies, and the place of radical thinking in times of political crisis. Hello, Rinaldo. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
I'm really glad you made the time. It's middle of summer. I know everybody's got a lot going on, but you made the time to talk today. I really appreciate it. I really love your work and your thoughtfulness on some of the more compelling and difficult issues in Black studies, also around questions of race, gender, sexuality. And so thinking about your work, thinking about this podcast series, for me, it was really essential to get you in as part of this conversation. So I really appreciate the time, and I really looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind words about my work.
So I wanted to start, and rather than start immediately with the question of Black studies and its meaning and its past and future, just really start with a question that's more personal about your own work. You know, what is it that drew you to the study of Black life, and what sustains you in that study, and also what draws you, now as professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department at the University of Buffalo. What sustains you in relation to the field? What drew you to the field? What drew you to this kind of study?
Well, that's a great question, and it offered me the opportunity to really reflect on my own intellectual development as a scholar and a thinker, and somebody who tries who wants to believe at least that what we do in universities really matter beyond universities. You know, as an undergraduate student, I did my undergraduate studies in English literature, and it was at the time where there was the transition from what they used to call Commonwealth literature to post-colonial studies.
Mm-hmm.
But while I was doing that, very few of my professors actually talked about to us as students what was going on in the field and the debates that were taking place. But that was literally happening. And of course, for me at that time, a lot of the courses that I took in my undergraduate studies would mean what would make considered Caribbean literature or third world literature. So I read a lot of stuff from the Caribbean, a lot of stuff from India, but also a lot of stuff of Caribbean writers writing in the U.S. and writing out of Britain, and so on. But at the time, I never conceptualized that as the kind of beginning of Black studies for me.
Mm-hmm.
But a number of the people who taught me were in some ways working within the field of Black studies, even though they also never articulated to that to
Mm-hmm.
us as students either. And simultaneously, I took these other courses in African studies, and I took these other courses on Black life in North America. And there were three particular professors: professor who taught African studies, Patricia Stant; a professor, Francis Henry, who worked on racism and Black people in Canada in particular, but across North America, and one of the people that had the most impact on me, who just died 2 months ago, a guy called Russell Chase, who I took a series of courses with on Caribbean women's writing. Um, I also worked for him as a teaching assistant when I went to graduate school. And those three people really had a profound impact on me, and everything that they taught was about Black people. And I took many courses with them, and I never thought that I was doing Black studies. And even when I went off to graduate school, like I knew that I was going to work on and to study Black people, but I still didn't conceptualize what I was doing as Black studies. I often conceptualized it as cultural studies. When one of my mentors, the late Roger Simon, introduced me to the work of Stuart Hall. And it was only as I kind of developed a critique of what at the time in the Canadian Academy, this is the early 1990s. 1990 is when I went to do my master's. What was then characterizing Canadian studies, anti-racism studies, my own dissatisfaction with that I began to articulate what I did as Black diaspora cultural studies, as opposed to Black studies. And for years, well into my doctoral work, I will go back between describing myself as doing Black diaspora cultural studies or cultural studies or Black Canadian studies. I wrote my dissertation on hip hop, and it was a dissertation that was trying to think about how this musical formation moved across various Black geographies. So I was really interested in hip hop as a diasporic formation. And it's out of those confluences that, and my ongoing, it's out of those confluences and my ongoing engagement with radical Black talk out of the Caribbean that really cemented to me that really what I'm interested in here and what I'm trying to do is to work inside a conversation that has began well before me, to try to make sense of initially my life in Canada, what it meant to be a Black person who had lived most of their life in Canada in a place that continued to deny Black existence as fundamental to its own constitution and its own making of itself. And so that's when I really turned solidly to articulating what I do as Black studies. And then of course, reading quite deeply in the field, understanding the debates in the field. When I was an undergraduate student, I had started reading Sylvia Wynter, but I was reading the work that she had written on the Caribbean. By the time I'm finishing my dissertation, I'm also reading the work that she's writing on Black studies in the US. And so her work and her thinking became the linchpin for me making a sense of what Black studies could mean and do in the world, and its various possibilities. That's how I come to Black studies.
Yeah, fascinating. No, I'm glad I asked. That's it's such an interesting narrative of doing Black studies without that name, and then what sort of coming to that name, and the content through Winter, what coming to content in that name, how that organizes what has been and what you continue to do. And I wanted to maybe then pick up on one of the first things you said in your response, which was as a comment. You said, as someone who believes that what we do in the academy matters in the world, right? I know it's not the exact words you use, but I mean that for me gets to the heart of the founding of Black Studies 50 something years ago, where it had those two competing, or maybe competing, but definitely in some tension, impulses. One was to provide a space to cultivate, appreciate, deepen, and develop the Black intellectual tradition, right? Because the disciplines as they were formed weren't doing this kind of work. The other was the political activism of students and communities, right? Of a different kind of relationship between universities and campus life, and people in outside of those walls, right? And the question of race, of course, being the thing that bridges those. So there is that competitive sort of competitive tension, I think, at the origin of Black studies between, it needs to have a kind of political orientation and agenda and consequence, and the other of this intellectual tradition and its cultivation. And I wonder, when you imagine the field, how you imagine that relationship of origin and that tension, because it really immediately came to mind when you said that what we do in the academy means something in the world.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think the tension that you articulate so well never dissipates, never disappears, and probably, given the nature of the contemporary academy, can be resolved. But nonetheless, because I come to Black studies with the idea that the university can do a tremendous amount of harm, and that indeed the university has done a tremendous amount of harm to Black people. That a lot of the knowledges and ideas and even policies that organize Black people's lives, both nationally and globally, are generated in universities or generated by people who have deep attachments to universities. That there's a pipeline between, our colleagues down the hall and government officials making policy. That there's a pipeline between our colleagues down the hall and police services. That there's a pipeline between our colleagues down the hall and the armies that can be sent to invade Grenada or to continue to legitimate the illegitimate blockade of Cuba and so on. So for me, the university is a site of struggle. And I think Black Studies helps us to crystallize that. So we don't just enter the university to be legitimated as a form of knowledge, a way of thinking, and a set of methods and practices and analyses. We also enter the university as a way to unmake the university, to make this university something other than it is, so that we can mitigate the harms that it does. This is one of the arguments and one of the ways of approaching Black studies that I've learned most profoundly from the work of Sylvia Wynter. And in some ways, Wynter suggests in a number of essays that, if you will, the incorporation of Black studies into the university is a part of its own defeat, right? Because it becomes caught up then in the normative procedure of the university, as opposed to undoing the university, which should have been its first intention. So I try to hold on to that. I try to hold on to that possibility that what I'm doing in the university matters, because the university is both a harm and therefore a site of struggle for Black people to transform those harms into something else. But also think, because the university is also a place that legitimates knowledge, that radical knowledge has to find a way inside the university, not to become the university. And this is where, I turn to that other brilliant Jamaican, Stuart Hall, and his ideas of within and against in the university, thinking about the role that cultural studies, and particularly the Birmingham Center, played. Hall never necessarily said that he did Black studies, but my own reading of him places him deep inside that genealogy of Black studies, from Du Bois to Winter to Hall and everything in between. And part of what I draw from that is, when Hall, in this the wonderful essay, Cultural Studies Theoretical Legacies, talk about, the idea that intellectual practice should mean something. To me, that's at home with Black studies. The Black studies demands that our intellectual practice means something. Not that we simply become fluent in theoretical languages, but that, the theory that we take up should have something to offer the world beyond the confines of the university. And so that, to me, is the demand and the command from Black studies, to be fully cognizant of the context within which it is that I'm operating, and to be clear about what it is that I seek to do with the knowledges that I create.
And there's something I think really important about, what you said. The harm that universities have done is this feeder system for the police, for the military, for various kinds of government. I mean, I teach at University of Maryland, which is just a few miles from Washington D.C., and like the number of things we feed to that is it can be quite terrifying for some of us. Um, but it also is that moment where the knowledge, as you were, you know, putting to piecing together for us there, where the knowledge that we produce and that we convey in our teaching as well, um, it re-enters the world. And how does it re-enter the world? And I think that it can be easy to think that what we do is completely apolitical and non-disruptive, and often, as you were saying, to become part of the university rather than to fracture it, to be insurgent, to be something different that way. But the fact is that our the very presence of Black studies, as we were talking about before we started this podcast, that itself is considered a very deep threat. And it's considered a deep threat for a reason. I mean, part of it is this pure hatred of Black people by the right wing in the United States, but it's also because the presence of this kind of work, and the process and the historical accumulation of knowledge production, there's something happening there that the right wing sees, and sometimes I wonder if we see it in our own work the way we should, because it would require us to commit to certain sorts of things. I mean, that's so much of what you were saying there, like to certain kinds of ways of talking and creating knowledge, but also creating that transition of knowledge back out into these places where other knowledges continue to do such harm.
Mhm. There's no doubt about that. Look, what Black Studies brings to the university is another account of what knowledge could mean. It's another, not simply just another interpretation, but an entirely different story of what it has meant to live our lives and the encounters we have had with each other. And that's really dangerous because it means then that what gets offered as the normative account, the white supremacist, in both its banal and violent forms, is immediately offered a counter response. And it is that counter response that they simply do not want to proliferate, because that the proliferation of that counter response tells a different story of all of the things that liberal democracies want us to believe have been their inventions, that liberal democracies want us to believe will save us, but that liberal democracies also deploy to hold in place the racial hierarchies that have harmed so many of us. So
Mhm.
Black Studies, in its initial inception, is meant to undo all of that.
Yeah. Let me loop this back into questions about your how you understand your own work. I mean, one of the things I like about your work, it draws on such a collage of interests, right? Poetics, right in the first person, personal, examples, anecdotes, narratives, as well as textual study and really complicated theoretical interventions. I will say, when I think about like what does a Black Studies book look like, right? I do think like Long Emancipation is one of those books, right? Because of that mixture of so many different things. And I'm curious, as somebody who, as you said, sort of came to this name of Black Studies after doing the work of Black Studies for, since the beginnings, it sounds, of your undergraduate education. I'm interested in how you think about your own work in relation to the past of Black Studies. How do you think it fits in with that tradition or that history of ideas? But also, what boundaries do you think it pushes? What is it? What new horizons do you think it opens up?
Mhm. That's a great question. One of the things that I would say that there are two thinkers that, that are like that haunt me. They're like specters. Um, W.E.B. Du Bois, and particularly the Souls of Black Folk, which I think is the urtext of a certain kind of Black studies scholarship that refuses disciplinarity as a mode of confinement and is able to say and do and enact a series of political questions, and affective relations all at once in a text.
Mhm.
And then I think the other person whose work haunts me is the late Edward Kamal Bradford from Barbados, the historian and poet whose own poetics and writing moves from, the traditional historical text to what he then calls his Sikarat's method, the broken words on the page that don't line up. And of course, then in later years, the computer graphics that he made use of on the page as well to try to piece together the story of a Black existence in the Americas and what it would mean to come to terms with that
Mhm.
fully so that we could become full beings again. And it's in their writing practices and the shifts that they're able to make across genre that has really been, for me, we were talking earlier and I was making, um, a critique of method in social sciences and so on. But I'm going to use the word now. But they have offered me a method to think about how one like structure what it is one like want to say to the world, to the communities that one imagines one is engaged with. And so I've been really interested in being able to write to and for and be engaged with a wide range of communities. And that can mean doing something like this, a podcast. It could mean writing an opinion piece. It could mean going on a television show. It could mean writing, your standard academic 30-page paper with 50 or 60 footnotes. Or it could mean, you know, or it could mean a range of different kinds of things. And one of the things for me about that is that, again, because, I see the university as a place that allows me a certain kind of breath, but I don't want to be totally subordinated to it. So even as a graduate student, I was trying to break with the form of the university as I did what I did because I didn't want to be beholden to tenure and I didn't want to be beholden to um, the normative practices of the university.
Mhm.
Having said that, I could also say that for whatever reason, I happen to be, I'm going to use the word luck, to be really lucky in how I have experienced the university thus far, meaning that, I was hired before I finished my dissertation into a tenure track job. You know, I've been tenured now at three different universities. It's all been pretty smooth in that sense. And no one has really ever fundamentally, at least in terms of my formal employment, questioned my relationship to scholarship.
Mhm.
Of course, my critics might, but in terms of my formal job, that hasn't occurred. Which is to say that because of those experiences, I've also been able to eschew a certain kind of way of doing scholarship. So I do scholarship on my own terms.
Mhm.
I write about things that I'm interested in. I read about things that I'm interested in, and I write about them in the way that I'm feeling about them at that moment.
Mhm.
And but I think that comes from having spent so much time reading and thinking with figures like Du Bois and
Mhm.
Graphic, and kind of really trying to imbibe the sense and the spirit of how they have done their own work. Not that I
Mhm.
could ever be them because, they're tremendously prolific and I'm just too lazy for that. but
Yeah.
the, but the spirit of their work and how they've done it really inhabits me in profound way.
Yeah, I know any of my students listening will say, "Oh God, he said Camel Brathwaite." My love of Camel Brathwaite in the classroom and in some current writing is very. I mean, I think his potential contribution to the field of Black studies is really in its like infancy in terms of appreciation. This history of the voice to me,
Mm.
so not to turn
It's
this
a
into a
brilliant,
podcast.
yeah.
And the movement between vernacular poetry, very formal poetry, and as you said, these experiments. And I agree with you. I mean, that's the thing. Souls of Black folk, and when I was at Amherst College, the students used to joke that, you knew you got your Black Studies degree when you had read Souls of Black Folk for the 40th time in a class. And it's like that for a reason. I mean, it's voracious, it's experimental, it's unafraid of any kind of voice it inhabits. And, uh, yeah, I mean, it is an urtext. I think urtext for me less in its the positive value of its claims and more in its chances and its risks. To use a word that you were talking about beforehand here. Um, and Brathwaite does so much of that, and is also just a completely captivating interview. So, yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Brathwaite is that his foresight into a series of questions about Black life in the Americas, and his insistence that that life is not safely cut off from something called Africa, um, has been profound. Some time ago, the journal Small Axe did a special section on one of his essays, Carving Man in Time and Place, and asked some of us to respond to that essay. And I wrote an essay on Black studies and carving studies, drawing from Brathwaite, and kind of making the argument that carving studies um, carving studies draws on a logic of pluralism because it still can't grapple ultimately with what blackness means. And I know some people in carving studies will be really upset with an argument like that because they need to hear something. Yeah, they need to hear about the Afro carving, the Indo carving, and so on and so forth. And my argument might seem like it was one of primacy, but it wasn't so much that I was trying to make a case about the primacy of blackness. I was trying to make the case that what comes to constitute the modern Caribbean rests on the foundation of the brutality of the Middle Passage and Black people's movement into that region. And Brathwaite's essay really helps us to think that through in really profound ways. So in a slight kind of way, I was like calling for the dissolution of something called Caribbean Studies and saying, let's just call it all Black Studies, even if you're just working on Indo-Caribbean people.
Yeah, no, I, Caribbean studies circles, I know those well. That's yeah, not to maybe this is off the podcast, but having published something saying the early Fanon and V.S. Naipaul had the same view of the Caribbean. Sometimes there are some precious buttons to push. You definitely push the good, but that's a good. I mean, that poses this really like difficult and really important question that's dear to my heart, which is the relationship between Black studies and Caribbean studies. So I'm glad you did that. So thinking about this studies term, maybe for a minute, I was also interested in asking you to talk a little bit about your own professional arrangements, right? Because appointments aren't just paychecks and jobs. I mean, they are that, but they're also places where we're emboldened and enabled and supported to do certain kinds of work. And so your own trajectory through your PhD into your various teaching positions have moved across studies, women and gender studies, the Ontario Institute for the Study of Education, if I got the acronym, if I remember it correctly, and now in Africana studies. So I'm curious how you think about that movement without ever being in a formal discipline, like without being in sociology, without being in English, without being in history or philosophy. How do you think that impacts both your teaching and your research?
Yeah, that's another one of those questions that really made me reflect deeply on how I arrive where I'm at the moment. And I mentioned this guy Russell Chase, the late Russell Chase, who was one of my undergraduate professors, and who I just took course after course with. And he's white guys in California who left the US in the 60s, around the time of the Vietnam War. I think he was a draft dodger. Arrived in Canada, ended up teaching at what became York University. When I went back to graduate school, as a way to make extra money, I became a teaching assistant for him.
Hmm.
He used to teach a course called Cultures of the Oppressed in the Afro Caribbean.
Hmm.
And it'd be like a course of like 200 students, and I would be the teaching assistant for like two groups.
I'm sorry, I got to interrupt you. 200 students in a
Yeah.
Caribbean studies class. I mean, the level of envy I have right now. This guy must have been great. I like the York students a lot too. Hearing this.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so yeah, I would be like the teaching assistant for like a couple of groups of that course. And while I was finishing up my doctoral studies, Russ Chase decided that he would retire. So they advertised a job where they said they were looking for a specialist in either Black North America or Latino North America.
Hmm.
And I decided I would throw my hat into the ring for this job, and I got the job.
Yeah.
I was writing my dissertation. I got the job. The job was in a department called, at the time at York University, it was called the Division of Humanities, and it was a big department. It had people who did Canadian studies, who did Jewish studies, who did religious studies, who did Caribbean studies. It was this amalgamation of humanists, and so I got the job. He went on, and I took over that course. It was one of the first courses that I taught. But I renamed it. I renamed it Cultures of Resistance in the Afro American.
Mm.
And that was a course where we would teach, like we would begin with the slave narratives and end with some kind of contemporary literary text.
Hmm.
Oh. And so, I taught at York University for 7 years, teaching courses like that. Um, and then I went back to the Ontario Institute of Studies and Education, which is where I did my PhD. And and there I continued to teach courses where an idea of blackness was the true line, but
Hmm.
not always but not all of the material necessarily centered around black people.
Hmm.
But blackness will always be the true line. And the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education is really the faculty or the School of Education at the University of Toronto. So there's both a graduate school and where teachers are trained, teacher education. And I got to play sometimes with teacher education. I would teach, like for instance, I would teach a course on black masculinity to teacher candidates. People were training to be teachers. Um, and that was a lot of fun and would be really interesting because they kind of felt like, I wasn't teaching them what they needed to do when they went in the classroom. I
Hmm.
was like, no, I'm teaching you what you need to do in the classroom, which is I want to teach you to think.
Yeah.
But
Love it.
um, but they didn't really want people like myself in teacher education. They wanted us in the graduate school, and that was fine.
Hmm.
But so for a number of years, I taught only graduate students, and I really liked that. But I also missed my time at York when I was also able to teach undergraduate students. So I started reaching out to other departments at the University of Toronto where I might be able to get access to undergraduate students. And at one point, the university came up with a policy that allowed those of us who were supposedly in professional schools, because the School of Education is considered a professional school,
Uh-huh.
that they can buy us out to go and teach undergraduates in other departments. So I
Mm.
ended up being able to teach for a number of years an undergraduate course in the Sexual Diversity Studies program. And for a number of years, I taught an undergraduate course there on the Black queer diaspora,
Hmm.
and had a wonderful time doing that. And then I shifted it to the Women and Gender Studies, where I taught a course on the cultures of Black, something like Black studies and Black cultural studies and women and gender studies, something like that. But I had like a slash. And, at the time that I did that, the scholar Jackie Alexander came to University of Toronto and was teaching in women and gender studies.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to move my appointment over there, and it didn't happen at that time. And then I ended up becoming the director of women and gender studies and was able to move my appointment over there. But the core of the work was always done through a logic of thinking about what happens if you center Black thought and Black ideas at
Mm-hmm.
any point in any of these formations. What other account of what we're doing might be made available? And so for me, I've not had to, beyond, the discipline of sociology of education, I've never had a job that was located within any of the traditional disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really important for me because I do see myself as an interdisciplinary scholar and as someone who's trying to think around a set of questions that can enliven debates around Black life and then what those debates around Black life might mean for others. And I just
Mm-hmm.
don't think that the disciplines can allow you to do that adequately.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who spent the early part of my career in philosophy departments, I will say the liberation that comes from not having to constantly ask the question, how is this a philosophical text? Or, whatever the discipline is, you can plug in the terms there. And what that does to your teaching, but also to your writing, because as you know, we read when we teach, and when we read, we start thinking about things to write about. But the not having to ask that question about, like, does this count? And I know there's really important work being done, for example, in philosophy to sort of loosen up, what counts as a philosophical text. But and that's important work. But the difference between a Black Studies department, where, as you said, it's if you center Blackness, what happens to the things we read? That's such a different kind of question as a scholar and as a teacher. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting story you told there in terms of those shifts and turns, and I like getting appointed as chair and then moving your appointment too. The kind of autocracy we need in this hemisphere. Well, let me ask you a sort of big speculative question. Thinking about the 50 plus years of Black studies, and what do you think that in the history of the field, what do you think the field has done particularly well, and what do you think it hasn't done particularly well?
That's a really tough question. It's a tough question because I think it's the kind of question going to get me in trouble. Scale has done something that's really interesting enough. I think that you've seen it in like maybe the last 5 years or so. But even as Black Studies has come under tremendous attack and pressure, Black Studies has also produced a tremendous desire for people who want to attach themselves to it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's produced desire really, really, really well. And all kinds of people are now claiming that they do Black studies or that they have always done Black studies or they want to bring Black studies to their traditional discipline, like, all the sociologists who want to reclaim Du Bois as a sociologist and so on and so forth. So I think Black studies producing desire for it as a knowledge form, a formation, a community of thinkers, an intellectual project has been really quite amazing.
Hmm.
At the same time, one of the things that has given me pause in all of that is also the ethnicization of Black studies. You heard me say that at one point that sometimes I would refer myself as doing Black Canadian studies. And I was always uncomfortable with saying that I do Black Canadian studies, not because of the Canadian part, because I think the best Black studies is always aware of the geography from which it operates in.
Yeah.
So for me, the Canadian part was being aware of the geography that I was operating from, but I was always trying to do Black diaspora studies.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think the ethnicization of Black studies has found itself regressively returning to the nation state as a legitimizer of what we do. And that troubles me.
Yeah.
And we see this in the UK where every spring or summer you're hearing about a different Black Studies program, the Black Studies program in history, or the
Mm.
MA in Black literature being under attack. Um, we also see this more largely in debates around Black Studies where we've seen departments shift their name from Africana or Black Studies to African American and so on. And of course, Sylvia Winter, to go back, Winter has been really um, fluent and articulate on this. And that whole notion of the ethnicization of Black studies, I get that language from her, in which she basically says um, that this idea, in which she basically says that this idea that Black studies gets nation centered, and she does this via critique of Emily Louis Gates, where she talks about how Harvard ethnicizes, Honor Gates ethnicizes Black studies into an African American studies and therefore subordinates it to a particular kind of logic of the nation state,
Mhm.
therefore kind of making less relevant the global connections that we seek to make. So before we formally began this, we were talking a little bit, and I was saying to you, given the kinds of pressures that we're seeing Black people being exposed to in all kinds of nation states, that diasporically Black people are going to have to make some strategic decisions about how we might live together and share this planet together
Mhm.
in the moment of climate breakdown and catastrophe. Like one of the things that like is always sitting in the back of my head is like I come from one of those islands that is totally susceptible to climate breakdown, Barbados. The
Mhm.
island of, 90 something percent Black people. It would make sense that if catastrophe was to strike, that those people would be able to move to North America. But the reality is that the way in which nation states are configured and the kinds of ways in which people position themselves inside of nation states, that Black people in North America might not want those people from the island where I was born to move this way.
Mm.
And so, right, they too might join forces with white supremacist nationalists to refuse those people. So, Black studies to me demands a global perspective, and I always giggle when I see people or departments advertise for like a position in Black global studies. Because I'm like, Black studies is always already global, right?
Yeah.
Why do you have to put global in front of it? Or when people say, well, our department is not just a Black studies department, it's a global Black studies department. And then when you look further, what you see is that they have fallen into a nation state trap. So they want somebody who does Black Europe. They want somebody who does Brazil. They want somebody who does the US. They want somebody who does Canada. They want right, and that to me is a kind of emptying out of Black studies. It's a kind of taking away an already assumed rigor of how Black people shape the modern world
Mhm.
into this avatar of the nation state. And so that's one of the things that I think that we haven't done well because we haven't hold on to the always already global aspect of Black studies. And the last thing I will say about this is like, in 68, you've got San Francisco State, but shortly after that, you've got places like Duke and so on coming on board with Black studies and Yale. And I'll give you one figure, I'll give you a figure because he's had a tremendous impact on me, but also um, he demonstrates the point that I'm making. The Black Canadian writer Austin Clarke, who was also born in Barbados, lived most of his life in Canada. But in '68, he's at Duke when Black Studies no, he's at Yale when Black Studies is being founded, right? So
Mhm.
this Black Barbadian Canadian man is right in the middle of it, right? And at the very moment that that is happening, all kinds of Caribbean writers, Yan Carew, and all kinds of people are moving through these programs and so on, helping to establish them. Sometimes as visiting writers, sometimes as visiting lecturers, and a range of kinds of things are happening. Where is the Black studies, even in that moment of tremendous turmoil in the US? is always already founded on a kind of global notion of what blackness might be.
Mm.
So, Clark at Yale in 68, 69 is just one example. But, then, he goes to Duke, he goes to, you know, um, and similarly, if you take a look at the history of Africana studies at Cornell, its own foundations are similar. You've got people from Panama and other parts of the Caribbean who are right there at the founding. And so, this idea then that Black studies is solely and only this kind of African American invention, where
Mm.
African American gets narrowed to a very particular kind of way of thinking about the Black person in the US, is
Mhm.
something that we have to refuse more often and be much more nuanced about as we talk about what Black studies has done well or failed not to do well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. There's a lot that comes with that, knowing different languages, you know, knowing different histories, and that's always I find in really short supply in Black studies. But it also there's something I just want to like underscore that this is still a position to take that pushes boundaries decades after the Black Atlantic. I mean, Gilroy, I know he had his particular interests in that book, but it was this movement of as he says, roots and what I would say pronounce as routes, ROUTS, right? And thinking about those routes as a foundation rather than a root in a particular nation and culture. Um, I don't know why maybe it's sort of aversion to Gilroy among many people or something, but there's something just it's when you were talking, I was like, this seems like a conversation we could have been having in the early '90s, but we're having it in 2024 with the same level of urgency and intensity. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I mentioned Du Bois and Brafe as having this tremendous impact on me in terms of how I practice my own work, but no other book has had as a profound impact on me and my work and the trajectory of my work as Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. When that book came out in 1993, the arguments of that book became the basis of the dissertation work that I did.
Mm.
And for years and years and years and years, I taught that book over and over and over and over again, for the very reason of its refusal to pin itself down to a particular kind of nation state discourse. The, to me, the importance of the idea and the concept of diaspora inside of Black studies has been for me the most urgent and remains the most urgent orientation. It's very clear to me, having read and taught and watched films and listened to music and everything that Black people create expressively, that the nation state as a unit of containment is one of the most troubling, um, one of the most troubling, what's the word I'm looking for here? One of the most troubling elements for Black life.
Hmm.
So by the time we get to by the time Paul Gilroy writes Post-Colonial Melancholia, and I'm like, okay, he wants to go back home to Britain. I'm a little bit disappointed by that, but I get it too, because we have affections and affectation to particular kinds of geographies and the places that have formed us. So as much as I now live across the Canada US border in Buffalo, which is my main address these days, right? I'm talking to you from Toronto because as soon as I can get to Toronto, which is a place that I have deep affection for, I come to Toronto. So I get post-colonial melancholia, but yes, I still think. I mean, and of course, there there's no perfect book, so
Yeah.
there are flaws to the Black Atlantic. but it opens up a space for dialogue and conversation and reflection that I think has not really been in many ways surpassed in the field. And even in my last book, The Long Emancipation, I write a little defense of it in that book as well, because I think that I think so many people who enter Black Studies after the publication of that work don't actually even realize that their work is often in relationship to it. But
Yeah.
see, all these books come out that have diaspora in their titles, and people are there doing the Latino diaspora, they're doing this, that, and I don't think that they really understand the way in which that book galvanized and returned us to thinking concretely and conceptually about diaspora in its many terms.
Yeah, no, I love that way of framing it. I agree. Having taught the book a number of times, it's interesting to me to reread it in exactly that way you just put it, of seeing my own relationship to the world of ideas being preformed by that in ways that I only realized sort of, as a kind of almost like an archaeological project. It's like, oh, there's some stuff hidden here that came from Black Atlantic, but also the ways students are both often baffled. Graduate students, I'm thinking in particular, baffled that it had to be written, but also, I think, often uncomfortable with how the lessons don't seem to circulate as much as maybe they had hoped it would after reading the book. Right. Yeah. Well, let me ask you another sort of big speculative question about the field of Black Studies, and this is not more, it's entirely future oriented. It's really about the success, like what would be a marker of the success or accomplishment of Black Studies? As I mentioned before in the second question I asked about the origins of the field, the part of the origin of the field is that the disciplines weren't doing the work of Black life on Black life. Right. So Black Studies is established as a place to do that. I think we can see in some fields more than others the real impact over 50 plus years of that. Like an English department, for example, is almost at this point like an area studies department. Any place that takes the study of Black life seriously in literature. Right. English departments have been transformed, I think, by Black Studies that way. Certainly history departments have, art history, philosophy to a lesser degree. Is the sign of Black Studies success and accomplishment in the future going to be that moment where it's no longer needed because the disciplines have become so different? Or is a sort of sign of this, I keep saying success, but really like the accomplishment of Black Studies to not do that? To have become something that can't be redistributed back to disciplines, and that's part of what I find so interesting about your own trajectory and your work is the way it isn't disciplinary, and is that the sort of development of the success of Black Studies to be a place that can never be redistributed to disciplines, or is that ultimately the goal of Black Studies to no longer be needed and to be in a position to dissolve itself?
No, 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 no. Black studies being redistributed to the disciplines is the defeat of Black studies. What Black studies, of the most radical Black studies wants to do is, when I say undo the university, I mean undo the disciplines. Again, going back to Stuart Hall, he articulates this around cultural studies, but I believe that it's also fundamental to Black studies. He says cultural studies want to give the disciplines back to themselves in ways that they can recognize themselves. Unfortunately, the ways in which Black studies gets distributed across the disciplines, whether it's in English departments, sociology departments, and so on, is to hold those disciplines intact. But then you've got the Black affect. And, no, we want to undo those disciplines because those disciplines have been the foundation of the production of knowledges that have tremendously harmed Black people. You take disciplines like sociology and psychology that pathologize Black people, the bell curve, all of this kind of stuff is still happening in universities right now. They happen in the disciplines. There's no space for them within Black studies departments because Black studies departments are often an entirely different account of the very conditions that those theories claim to answer and respond to,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those pathologizations. Black studies offers an entirely different account. But if you're in the discipline where you're doing the Black work in that discipline, you still find yourself having to grapple with that. So Black studies rejects all of that. Black studies, um, in my view, and in the way that I've read and taught with this material, wants to make another university. It wants to usher in an entirely different intellectual project. It understands that the knowledges that have been produced in the contemporary university, especially post 68, don't only just simply need to be contested, but they need to be radically transformed. It understands, as Vinter has taught us, that the modern university is really very much indebted to the partiality of a certain kind of white supremacist logic. You know, in her essay, in her short essay, A Letter to My Colleagues, No Human Involved. I mean, what when Vinci says, she says in that essay, that what the university has to do is to produce knowledges that can work towards the liberation of the archipelagos of poverty. Um, the the fellow that gets murdered by the police and is called and is referred to as no human involved. That if our work is not doing that, then we're not doing the Black studies that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And the disciplines as they presently constitute, they can't do that. In fact, they're invested in reproducing that. They're invested in reproducing the no human involved narrative. So Winter in that letter offers us a kind of radical account of what knowledge work can do to remake how it is we inhabit this world. She's engaged in a project of asking us to reconsider how we make sense of what it is we already know, and how we can bring what we already know into being the legitimate account of the world, as opposed to the kinds of accounts that we get from people who do the bell curve and these other kinds of things. Right now, their account gets to be the legitimate account, not ours. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, Black studies. I tell this story another way. In 2010, I was at the University of Texas at Austin. I was a fellow at the Warfield Center. Um, Edmund Gordon, Ted Gordon, was in that moment creating the African Diaspora Studies Department at the University of Texas. And there was some conversation between Ted and I about whether or not I would move there and become a member of that department in its early founding. So I went down to visit for 6 months to see whether or not that would be the case. And as news came out that this department was going to happen, a number of departments, including the English department, said, but we don't really need a Black Studies department. We've got people here who are doing it in our department already. And so that was a really interesting way of saying, we've got it contained. I don't think that when they said that they meant we've got it contained in necessarily a negative way. But they're like, we're doing it. We've got it. So why would we need a department? But what that story didn't account for is that the English department or the philosophy department or the history department has a routinized way of how they understand what they're doing. And whether or not you're the Black affect or the Black special effect in that discipline, you still have to meet its parameters in certain kinds of ways. And of course, most of the people who came out, who founded that department at the University of Texas, came out of a subgroup in anthropology. Edmund Gordon and Zhao, what's Zhao's last name now? Anyhow, they were all in anthropology and became the founders of that department. And part of the reason that they were fleeing anthropology because they were doing a very different kind of anthropology, right? They were doing an anthropology that, yes, sometimes was an anthropology that studied communities elsewhere, but they were also doing an anthropology of U.S. anti-Black racism.
Hmm. Hmm.
And of course, the discipline of anthropology, by and large, demands that you don't study where you're at. It demands that you go study the other. And so, again, the disciplinary routinization would contain Black studies rather than allow it the kind of proliferation that an anti-disciplinary um, pedagogy and intellectual exploration demands.
Yeah.
And so, Black studies in its best orientation is anti-disciplinary.
I would love us to adapt that phrase or that term, anti-disciplinary, rather than just simply a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. That's a fantastic way of putting it, and I mean, you built to that term. That was fantastic. I think so much of what you're talking about too. Anyone who's been in a Black Studies department who's joint hired with a discipline can tell the hours long stories about what it was what it was like to try to convince an anthropology department that this Black Studies person who does anthropological work is worth it's not worthy of being in an anthropology department, but worthy of being a scholar and doing scholarly research and knowledge production. To your point, there's something deeply upsetting about that, and that's a good thing, right? rather than add some sort of sugar to make that easier to take. Maybe the unassimilable and the disruptive character is exactly what we need. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you as a final question. In thinking about the field of Black Studies, what is a question you think we should all be asking as the field sort of moves into this next decade, which I think is going to be a really intense decade for us under right-wing attack globally, but certainly within the United States with particular focus. But over the next decade, what do you think is a question we all really should be asking?
Whew. I mean, let me frame this by saying that I think Black studies is in crisis both within and without.
Mm.
I still think that I think the Black studies still hasn't dealt well with the intervention Black feminist critique. I still don't think that it has adequately dealt well with queer and trans critique. And it most definitely is deeply in crisis around the intervention, the theoretical and political intervention of Afro-pessimism.
Mm.
I think those three moments have really put Black studies in an interesting internal crisis. And it's a crisis, especially on the question of feminism and queer studies. That crisis has been ongoing. And I think that Afro-pessimism has helped us to highlight some of that because of its own critique of around questions of gender and sexuality as really being in some ways non-existent, given that it is the status of the slave not to be even able to hold those categories. And then there's the external critique, as we were talking about earlier, that begins with the attack on critical race theory and morphs into an attack on Black studies. Any of us who are concerned, we all paid attention to what happened with the AP courses in Florida and the ways in which both, interestingly enough, a certain kind of Ivy League African American studies figures, certain Ivy League African American studies figured into that conversation, where Black studies got recast really as a problem of Black history.
Yeah. Yeah.
and what became particular under pressure there was feminist and queer critique as well. That got pushed out, and the thing got reduced in some ways to from Black Studies to Black History.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got these two kinds of moments and modes. And I think for me, the thing that cuts through all of that, and something that I've been thinking a little bit about and trying to write about, and will probably write a lot more about in the coming months and years, is the debate about reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that the debate around reparations have reduced reparations down to simply an economic argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that reparations demands something more than economic.
Yeah.
And because I think it demands something more than economics, it means then the future of Black studies lies in how Black studies articulates what Black people actually want and need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what Black people actually want and need is a different arrangement of how human life is, of how we're able to live something that we call human life.
Mm-hmm.
This is what, I think that, the people who were doing Black studies, even before it was formally called that, have been making the case for. This is what I think we keep returning to. This is why I think winter is as important to me as Du Bois. This is why Kamal Brathwaite, Derek Walcott, Amy Césaire, all of these folks inform the way I think about the way I do what I do, because at heart of their project is a political project of transformation,
Yeah.
a political project of the remaking of the procedures by which it is that we're able to live a life as a life. And I think that Black Studies is going to have to come back to that question
Mm-hmm.
of what does it mean to live a life as a life in the ongoing context of racial hierarchy. But of course, that becomes even more complicated in a post 68 world where Black people are also now deeply implicated in the very violences that are enacted on Black people. The US had a Black president, and what happened in that moment continues to play itself out. But it was not a radically transformative moment for Black life in the US. And so the kind of question then, and you mentioned your interview with another scholar who says that we're going to have to rethink what Blackness is. I think we're going to have to rethink what Blackness means in the world,
Yeah.
which is to say that we're going to have to rethink what Blackness can do as a way of telling a story of what, not only where we've come from, but what it is where we need to head in the future. And so for me, that brings me then, I'm like following and reading and looking at, and it dips into my recent work, but not in a sustained way. But of course, I am consumed by climate collapse, and I'm looking at what other scholars are doing around what they're calling Black ecologies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I think that if they stay at it, and if they don't get co-opted and bought off through various kinds of grants and so on and so on, fellowships, that they're going to open up some really interesting arenas for us to think about new forms of Black diaspora solidarity.
Yeah.
Because this work on Black ecologies means something beyond the nation state. You can't only do that work and be concerned with the parameters and the boundaries of the nation state if you're going to do that work really well. But that to me is one of the places where I think the future of Black studies lies. But I also think that the other thing that I'll say that I think a future of Black studies lies is to see how scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharp have broken form in Black studies,
Mm-hmm.
and will have through either their practice of writing or through theoretical interventions like critical fabulation that Hartman does, open up also new arenas for us to think about what it might be possible to say and do,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore to offer us a different gaze, a different lens on what's at stake for thinking Blackness in the modern world, in the late modern world. So
That was wonderful. And look, that is so much to think about, and it's a really perfect place to conclude because raises all these critical questions that could not be more urgent, but also, as you pointed out, because you didn't just list, right? You got into some depth there. The complexity of that series of questions that you asked, that requires an entire scholarly community of commitment to study and to critical discourse and debate. And I love how you laid that out so clearly right there. So thank you for that. But thank you for all of this. As I said at the beginning, I really love and respect your work and was looking forward to this conversation. And there's so much to think about in this time we've been talking. And I really appreciate your time, but I really also appreciate your just frankness and clarity on these issues in Black studies and the study of Black lives. So thank you so much, Ronaldo. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me, John. I love having these conversations with you, and I'm looking forward to reading all the new work that's coming. I'm
Yeah.
excited. I'm excited for it.
I hope it won't be too disappointing, but it's
I'm sure it will not be. I'm sure it will not be.
always say about books, is my first nightmare is that no one will read it, and the second nightmare is that someone will read it. So read generously.
I think that's shared.
Yes. All right. Well, take care and have a great rest of your day.
You do too. Thank you, man.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.